Hello everybody, my name is McKeever here today, and today we're going to talk about the end of World War II and what does that post-war Europe/world look like. Alright, so at the end of the war, this is what Europe looks like. It is a pretty much just disastrous wasteland of space. So you're looking at Warsaw right here, the capital of Poland. You're looking at Tokyo. You're looking at London, Stalingrad. And these cities are absolutely devastated and destroyed after the war, and there's 70 million people that are dead along with it, 20 million of which came from the Soviet Union itself. Two-thirds of those people were civilian. This is what makes World War II such a travesty in history, is that the vast majority of the people who died in the conflict had no guns. They never picked up a rifle. They never went to fight. They were people who died in the Holocaust, the rape of Nanking, and the various other atrocities the Japanese did during their occupation. It's from the firebombings of Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, where the atomic bombs were dropped, from the firebombing of Dresden, from the destruction of Stalingrad, from the London blitzes, the Bataan death marches. All of these things led to a massive casualty total that is absolutely unfathomable in relation to the rest of the world. So, how do you deal with this? Well, if you're some countries, you don't. If you're looking at a Poland where 1/5 of your population is dead, that's kind of hard to recover from. Soviet Union, when you're looking at over 20 million people dead, that's absolutely terrifying. China, almost 20 million people dead. So it's going to be an interesting situation how certain nations have to deal. Some countries don't have a lot of losses. Look at the United States. Our losses are relatively minuscule in comparison to the rest of the world. Even Indonesia loses 4 million people thanks to Japanese aggression there. So we just have a ton of loss of life, and it's really terrible. Along with that, we have 50 million people that are left without homes, particularly in Europe. The homes were destroyed as very bombing efforts and other efforts absolutely tried to bring the war to their enemies. Many of the major cities of Europe, like Berlin, London, Moscow, Warsaw, are left destroyed. Some places, like Paris and Rome, are pretty much untouched, but the vast majority of the major cities of Europe have seen some sort of war effort. And then, probably worse during all of this, is that because of the war effort and because of how long the war took, many farms are left completely unattended. So you have 50 million people without homes and a bunch of people who are eating. So, how does this all turn out? Well, it turns out in every possible way it could go worse. The poor harvest that exists due to there not being farmers leads to mass famine throughout Europe. When there's famine, there becomes disease, and then topple on top of that, we have one of the worst records in modern, or worst winters in modern history. We have millions more people who are probably going to die in the years right after World War II. And unfortunately, there's not much of a plan in order to fix these things. The situation is just terrible. So, how do you fix it? Well, it takes time and planning. And to be fair, the Allied leaders have been getting together for quite a while in order to figure out how they want this all to work out. But it's not just an instantaneous plan and solution that goes into effect. In fact, we actually see Churchill and FDR meeting before the United States is actually involved in World War II, starting to talk about what a battle plan in Europe would look like and also what a post-war Europe would look like. And this happens at the Atlantic Charter out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. What they decide is that they're going to take some time to do this. The ideas here are going to be modeled after what Woodrow Wilson described in his 14 points. They are going to be nothing reminiscent to what the Treaty of Versailles was. It's going to be a very deliberate, thought-out solution to the violence in order to prevent another war. So after the Atlantic Charter takes place, we see the United States getting involved in the war after Pearl Harbor, and then the three Allied powers that are left, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, will meet for the first time in Tehran. It is here where the three, great leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, even though calling Stalin great is kind of terrifying, uh, decide what the rest of the war is going to look like. It's decided here that the Allies will invade at D-Day. It's decided the Soviets will kind of take care of the East on their own. And there's also some start-off inclinations of what Europe's going to look like, now including the Soviets in the conversation. What's interesting here is that a lot of the ideas that are brought up in Tehran don't really see fruition after the war, because it's here that Stalin understands now the medical condition of Roosevelt is, and he's kind of anticipating that Roosevelt's not going to be around that much longer, and he's right. A little bit after a year, I believe, of a year later after Tehran is going to be the death of FDR, and then it's going to be Truman's game after that. But the war is taking shape, and we're kind of in the final stages now. Once the Allies invaded D-Day, we're wrapping things up in Europe pretty quickly after that. And when things do wrap up, they have the problem of trying to resolve what do you do with a bunch of countries that don't have governments. Germany and Italy's governments were both fascist regimes that have been, removed from power. Italy's government was, France's government was sympathetic to the German Nazis and is also completely dismantled. Pétain and all the leadership involved in that are gone. So how do you rebuild that as well too? You're looking at a Europe now where three of the major powers are in complete disrepair. And then you also take into account that Spain technically still has a fascist dictator over there, so they're not a part of the equation at all too. And then you have Stalin in the east, and you just have a situation that is really short of solutions. So what ends up happening? Well, what we see is the rise of Marxism in Europe again. After the end of the war in France, VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, we see various communist governments pop up around Europe, particularly places like Italy and France. But unfortunately for those governments, they decide to try to consolidate power too quickly. They become too greedy, and because of that, the people turn on them. I guess it looked too resemblant of the fascist regimes that were there, and those governments become overthrown. And what you have is a series of governments again that are just unstable. Europe needs some form of leadership. It needs a concrete path to follow along. And what they decide is that the major powers need time. So they're going to get that time in what we call the Nuremberg trials. We decide that we're going to hold the German high command responsible for their actions. And in doing so, we provide closure for those who were affected by the Holocaust, and at the same time, we give them something to pay attention to while the major powers were starting to figure out exactly what a concrete plan could be for post-war Europe. So what happens at these trials? Well, the various Nazi leaders that are left are going to be held on trial. 22 Nazi war criminals are held on trial for crimes such as waging a war of aggression and for crimes against humanity. It's during these trials that we come to understand the various experiments that were done on members of people at the concentration camps, things done by Dr. Mengele and his other terrible assistants. And 10 people are found guilty of war crimes and they are cremated at Dachau. Unfortunately, only one member of the German High Command is there. The rest of them have all committed suicide long before. Hermann Goering at least made it to the end of the war, but while serving time in jail cell, hung himself, and, yeah. So Nuremberg provides that little bit of closure, and it provides us a little bit of time. So it's not exactly great. What also we have to remember is that this isn't just a war happening in Europe, too. In Japan, we have a scenario that we have to play out as well, but it's going to be pretty unilaterally done by the United States. Japan is obliterated. China is kind of in terrible shape itself right now. And Soviet Union never got involved in the conflict, which was kind of by design. So really, this is just going to be the United States and Japan hammering out the details. The leader of the American forces in Japan, a guy by the name of General Douglas MacArthur, is going to be the one who's kind of spearheading the post-war efforts there. And it's designed as a plan built around peace, fairness, and demilitarization. Peace is very simple. We just don't want to fight anymore. Demilitarization sounds pretty fair in this regards in that, hey, you don't get to have a military for a while. But there's even stipulations to that we want to make sure that we're protecting Japan as well, too. But also we want to make sure that this process is fair. We don't want another Treaty of Versailles. We want the Japanese to buy into the treaty, to understand the different provisions that exist in it, and make sure that they agree to it so that this doesn't lead us to the resentment that eventually led to World War II. So what does this actually look like? Well, we're going to have our own sort of trials in Japan. We have our Tokyo War Crimes trials that'll take out General Tojo and his other members of his high command. All of them are found guilty and executed, and unlike the Germans who all committed suicide, the Japanese don't, because that's against their cultural beliefs. You are held responsible for your actions, and they live to that, and they are executed for their crimes. We also see eventually progress in the actual government of Japan. Japan is going to go from having that fascist dictatorship to having a democratic government. MacArthur and his advisors will create a constitutional monarchy that is going to be built around a parliament, a two-house parliament. And we will improve their economy in only in the regards that we allow for more land ownership. We don't jumpstart it. We don't want to give the Japanese a leg up on their Asian counterparts like China and Indonesia, because that wouldn't be fair, especially considering what the Japanese did to those peoples. Alright, so we are learning our lesson. Things are going to be fair. They are going to be better. A few other provisions of the Japanese treaty is that the Japanese emperor is no longer declare himself a god. He is just a human being. He can be an emperor, he can be a king, but he's just like the British queen or the British king. They are figureheads, nothing more than just figureheads. The real power will lie in the parliament itself. They will have a universal suffrage for all people over the age of 20, and they will have a prime minister who's chosen by the Diet. And that's the same form of government that exists in Japan today. We actually have close relations with the Japanese government, and it's worked out pretty well. Alright, so we're all friends now. And what's it look like today? Well, today we have the peace treaty signed by the Japanese and the Americans that is officially signed in 1951, which, if you think about it, that's 6 years after the end of World War II. So we really did take our time in doing that. And also, as a fun bit of history, the actual treaty itself will be signed on the USS Missouri, because, go Missouri. And it'll be pretty all-encompassing. The United States and 47 other nations signed that treaty with Japan ending the war. We will leave Japan after that, but we do also maintain military presence in Japan. Since we stripped Japan of its armed forces, we are going to be the protecting armed forces of the Japanese, and that's still largely the same way today, even though Japanese are allowed a defense force today. We are still pretty much their line of defense between them and any enemies that they may have. Alright, and that pretty much wraps up the war in Europe and in Japan. So that means that we are really boiling down for the unit. Thanks and have a great day. Bye-bye.